guys, it's Erin, and welcome to the year of the 18th century. So before we get started, I want to acknowledge that I totally filmed this video and got almost to the very end. I was about to do my outro and then the video just disappeared. So I'm a little salty about that. Anyway, 18th century. I have been wanting to learn more about the 18th century. My academic interests are kind of shifting into the 18th century, and I don't know a lot about the period, and so I would like to personally know more about it. I also realized that on the kind of classics booktube, we don't talk a lot about 18th century books. It's this weird kind of vacant hole, and I think people maybe are a little afraid of them. They feel a little bit older and more foreign than books from like the Victorian period, and we just don't know a whole lot about the period, so we sort of stay away from it. And that's a shame because there are a lot of really amazing books from the 18th century and a lot of really interesting conversations happening in the 18th century. So as a result, we're missing stuff. So that's this year. So what that's going to look like for me is I'm going to attempt to have the majority of my classics reading be books from the 18th century. I have plenty of 18th century books to read. We'll see what the majority looks like. That might be 3, it might be 7, it might be 15, who knows? I'm also going to be reading about the 18th century, including this book, which I will be sort of starting the year off with. And then I'll be using what I'm reading and learning about to make videos to kind of start to educate you guys. I'm not gonna promise a whole series. I don't know how much time I'm gonna have, but I will do as many as I possibly can. So if there are things in the 18th century that you're curious about, definitely let me know, and I'll try to kind of shape my interests in those directions. I will say that I will probably be focusing on the 18th century novel, and it will be English and American literature. Although if you would like to participate in this challenge with me, read whatever you want in the 18th century. There were a lot of interesting things going on in a lot of different countries all around the world, and there are plenty of opportunities to read pretty diversely, actually. I'm not going to, mostly just because my academic focus is English and American literature, and so I feel like I need to keep my focus narrower just to kind of make this worth my time, because part of the point of this is to educate myself for my own like school stuff. So that's what we're doing. I am going to try to read as many women writers as I can. There were a lot of them in this period, and we don't talk about them as much as we ought to for various reasons. They were writing genre fiction, they were women, so we don't like to talk about them. There were a lot of interesting things happening in this period. We have the rise of the English novel, we have and all of the kind of questions associated with that. What does it look like? What is a novel versus not a novel? What are the expectations and conventions of a novel? You see very early this kind of split into the sort of more literary novel and the kind of genre fiction novel. By like the 1760s, you have Gothic fiction, which is sort of more genre fiction than the kind of like literary stuff that people were writing. And you see it open a space for women readers and writers to step into, which is really interesting and sparks this very kind of contentious conversation. You have lots of poetry being written. Poetry of this period is not my favorite, but I would like to get better acquainted with it. Maybe I'll find some new favorites. And towards the end of the century, you see the beginnings of the Romantic movement, which I do find interesting, so I'd like to explore that more. You also see a lot of nonfiction. Printing is just getting easier, paper is getting less expensive, and so things like magazines and newspapers are becoming affordable to print and disseminate, and so you're seeing the beginnings of a kind of news culture, which is really interesting. And also people are traveling more, and you're seeing people write about their travels. It's a time of exploration still, and people are really interested in reading about other people's journeys to foreign countries and places like North Africa and India. So there's a lot of stuff going on kind of literarily in this period to explore and to dig into and to kind of find out more about. And I feel like even if your focus isn't the 18th century, because so much of what started in this period we see in the 19th century, if you read 19th century and Victorian literature, you'll see the roots of those things that you are interested in the 18th century. Like I said, I am going to make this a focus for my whole year, although it won't be the only thing that I focus on, and I won't only read 18th century classics, so if you're not super interested, stick around. There will be other things going on. But if you would like to participate, I know saying like join me for an entire year of reading 18th century books is maybe not the most interesting thing for you, or in line with your own reading goals, but I am going to have a month-long readathon in April that I'm calling 18th Century April because it alliterates. That is literally the only reason I picked April, where I'll focus my channel on the 18th century really specifically in that month, and I will post a video probably like mid-March detailing some challenges and some ways that we can kind of join together and explore the 18th century together in a more limited context. So look out for that. I'm super excited. And that's my focus. That's why I want to do it and how you can join me. For the rest of the video, I'm just going to really briefly recommend some 18th century books that you may have heard of or you may have not. I find it kind of hard sometimes to, like, when people start talking about a period of literature, to wrap my head around what that entails, like who's writing during this period. So this is entirely novels because that's all I have for the 18th century, but I found when I decided to do this challenge that I had actually collected a lot of 18th century novels that I hadn't read yet. So I think in my pile of unread books, I think I only newly purchased one of the whole stack. So clearly my subconscious was telling me something. It is time to read these books. First we have Pamela by Samuel Richardson, and this is considered by some to be the first English novel, although it's kind of late 1740. It's an epistolary novel, so it's written in letters, and it's about a young woman, a serving girl, who is trying to escape becoming the mistress of her master. Written just a few years after Pamela, we have Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, which is a chunker. It is about the life of Tom Jones. That is all I know, but it is one of those kind of like great early novels, and so I feel like I need to read it. He seems like he might be a bit of a libertine, to judge from the picture that is gracing the cover of this book. An earlier writer who probably deserves the honor of first English novelist. Actually, he doesn't, because that goes to a woman who wrote in the 1600s, but that's okay. Somebody who really was maybe not actually the first English novelist, but closer, is Daniel Defoe. His best-known book is Robinson Crusoe. This would be a reread for me, and so it might be a little bit lower priority, but this is about a guy who gets shipwrecked on an island for 20 years and how he survives, and it's considered kind of one of the great classics of this period. Another book by Defoe that I am more interested in prioritizing this year is Moll Flanders. This follows the life of a lower class woman from her birth to her death, and it sounds really interesting because it's a woman and she is lower class, so she is not the most reputable person, and for 1721 or whenever this was published, that's a little bit scandalous. Another early 18th century writer is Jonathan Swift. His most famous book is Gulliver's Travels, which is about a seaman who keeps getting shipwrecked on islands with strange beings, tiny people and giant people, and you've probably read parts of Gulliver's Travels if you took a British literature class, and I have also only read parts of Gulliver's Travels. Probably if you took all the parts together, I would have almost read the whole book, but I would like to read the whole thing cover to cover at some point. Then we have the book that started this whole obsession, which is the Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy Gentleman by Lawrence Sterne. I really loved this book. It's a bit of a parody already and has some really interesting things to say about the burgeoning novel culture. I have a whole video about it. I'll link it down below. I won't bore you with it right here, but I highly recommend. I won't be picking this one up, obviously, because I've already read it, but I recommend that you read it because it's super fun. Just don't expect a plot, because there isn't one. We have also The Vicar of Wakefield by Oliver Goldsmith. This is a title that I keep coming across, and I picked this book up at a library sale a couple of years ago, and I haven't read it. I don't know anything about it, but I feel like Oliver Goldsmith is one of those authors that you should read if you're going to read books from the 18th century, because I've just seen his name enough times that I feel like I need to read him. So he's also on the list. Then we have Charlotte Lennox's The Female Quixote, which is another book that I don't know a whole lot about, except that the main character, Arabella, is a reader of novels, and that figures into the main plot, so I'm very interested in that. This book kind of stands in for all of the female writers that I'm interested in exploring. Unfortunately, they're just like not as well known, and so I would like to kind of dig up their names and dig up their books and see if I can't find who they were and what they were writing. She's the beginning of that. And then we have Charles Brockden Brown was actually an American writer. He's one that I hadn't really heard of before this past year when I read his novel Edgar Huntley for a class, and really enjoyed it. It was super weird and Gothic, but also very American Gothic, and it was just, I just really enjoyed it so much. So this is another book of his, Wylands, and then an unfinished manuscript. I don't know anything about it, but I'm looking forward to reading more about Charles Brockden Brown and making his name a little bit better known, since he's such a weird and interesting writer. And then speaking of weird and interesting, I also have 3 Gothic novels that I have read in the past that are from the 18th century that I really loved and just, again, found weird and interesting. This is, if you wanted to, you could just read Gothic fiction from the 18th century and it would keep you busy all year because there's so much of it. A lot of it's really bad, but some of it's really good. This one is not good. This is Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, but it is considered the first Gothic novel, and it sets a lot of the tropes and themes for Gothic fiction kind of going forward. It's super short and totally worth reading. You can just read it in an afternoon if you want something kind of weird and funny. It's not humorous. It's funny because it's bad. Another one that's just kind of shocking and crazy. This was published in 1798, so it's very, very, very tail end of the 18th century, but this is The Monk by Matthew Lewis. It is another Gothic novel. It is so strange. There are ghosts, there's incest, unexpectedly. I spent the whole novel being like, I'm sorry, what are we doing? When was this novel published? There's nothing graphic in it. It was a sensation when it was published, and I can see why. Just so crazy. So crazy. I still feel like I read this book 5 years ago and I still have feelings about it. So, and then we have the great Anne Radcliffe. I have only read The Mysteries of Udolpho, but she wrote quite a lot of fiction, Gothic fiction again, but more serious, and I would say more literary Gothic fiction, although it's still kind of sensational. But she likes to kind of undermine and play with the tropes and conventions of Gothic fiction. So she'll set up, oh no, there's a ghost, what's it gonna do? And then actually it's not a ghost at all. It's, you know, a real human explanation, and she does that kind of thing, which I find really interesting. She was incredibly popular and well-known in her day, and I think we should read more Anne Radcliffe. So that is my one big reading goal for the year, to focus on the 18th century. If you have anything that you would like to know about the 18th century, or any works in this pile that you would be interested in seeing me read, or any works in this pile that you've read and would love to tell me about, please join me in the comments. Let me know if you're excited for 18th century April. I know I am. I hope at least a couple of you participate. And that is it for this video. I will see you in the next one. Bye.